everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 146 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, don't get it twisted. Or should you? Because we're going to talk about difficult rotational athletes. If you work with baseball players, you work with golfers, you work with throwers, you work with tennis players, you work with anyone who's got to, come on, baby, let's do the twist. This is the debrief for you wonderful, sexy, outstanding people. And the reason why, folks, is because your boy, World War Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam, recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question. Actually, both of these questions, so I got two today, come from Terry. Here's what Terry asks. I've noticed that roughly 75 to 80% of my baseball players are narrow infrasternal angles, ISAs. Terry works with about 99% of baseball players. Do you feel this is representative of a normal population? I'm wondering if this is a case of selection bias where narrow ISAs, being more eccentrically oriented, have an easier time rotating, and therefore would be more likely to advance in a rotational sport like baseball or golf. Whereas a more concentrically oriented wide ISA may have a more difficult time and as a result would be more biased towards sports requiring less rotation. I think Terry's onto something here. It's not a perfect translation, but he's definitely on the right track. So what we have to look at is how rotation differs between a narrow and a wide infrasternal angle. And the hashtag major key, I'm like a skinnier DJ Khaled, but the major key is what the obliques are doing in each of these infrasternal angle presentations. Now, based on the shape of the lower rib cage, certain obliques are going to have more leverage in a narrow versus a wide. And there's a great paper that I'm pulling from that looks at the inter-rater reliability of infrasternal angle presentations. They go into how the external versus internal oblique differs depending on the shape of the rib cage. And if you want to check that out, well, folks, you need to check out the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/rotational-athletes. There's going to be a podcast, the high-def YouTube version, and an accompanying blog, as well as links to everything else. Definitely check it out when it's up on Sunday. In this paper, they talk about two different obliques, the external and internal oblique. If you are a wide infrasternal angle, your internal oblique has better leverage. If you are a narrow infrasternal angle, your external oblique has better leverage. This has to do with the attachment points of these respective muscles. External is more on the outside of the rib cage. Hence, if I have a narrow ISA, the outer attachments are going to be able to compress and rotate the rib cage much more effectively. Internal oblique is a little bit more internal on the rib cage and has more of its attachments along the iliac crest, among other locations. Now, when you are rotating your body, your obliques are your biggest rotators in the lower part of the thorax. Both need to work in order for you to rotate. External oblique works on one side, internal oblique works more on the other side, and then when you go the other way, it flip-flops. But we have to look at how those oblique muscles impact the abdominal viscera when we perform rotation. Because it turns out, folks, that the ability to manipulate the viscera can be a rate-limiting step in your supreme rotational clientele. Stay tuned. With each ISA presentation. Both obliques, internal and external, have the capability of compressing the abdominal cavity. So when you contract them bilaterally, it makes the abdominal cavity smaller, it compresses. That's one reason why the abs are a muscle of exhalation, because it helps squeeze the air out by compressing the viscera. Now, folks, we have to ask ourselves, which abdominal obliques would have better compressive capabilities in the ab wall? I'm glad that we asked ourselves. The key muscles that would compress the ab wall are the external obliques over the internal obliques, because they have greater leverage to do so, because they are more superficial. They can push on the rib cage a lot harder. When that push on the rib cage happens, based on the narrow infrapubic angle that is seen with a narrow infrasternal angle, remember folks, has more concentrically biased external obliques. When I squeeze the lower rib cage, the viscera is going to move downward. Since the infrapubic angle is narrowed and I have much larger surface area in the top part of the pelvis, aka the pelvic inlet, the guts have the capability of moving down, getting out of the way of the upper part of the lower thorax to allow me to rotate effectively. So I squeeze it down so the guts don't limit my rotational capabilities, because they're not taking up as much space in the lower thorax. Since there's a lot of rotational action in that area, theoretically, a narrow ISA is going to have an easier time rotating, because they don't have the physical block as much of the viscera. The viscera will get in the way. On the flip side, a wide ISA has a problem with visceral mobilization when they're rotating. Because the rib cage is wider, the internal obliques don't have as good a leverage depressing the viscera, because the internal obliques can't compress the lower rib cage as well as the external obliques can. That's one thing. The other thing is, for those individuals who are wide ISA, having a wider infrapubic angle and a nutated sacrum, the pelvic floor is going to be more ascended. So when the wide attempts to push the viscera downward, you have a pelvic floor that is pushing upward. So the guts ride a little higher in the case of the wide infrasternal angle. So the guts stay up higher in the lower part of the rib cage. And so those infrasternal angle presentations are not going to have as easy of a time moving the guts out of the way when they go through the rotational action of a baseball swing or a golf swing. And because of that, those differences in the ability to mobilize the viscera, in the lower rib cage, the narrow infrasternal angle theoretically has an easier time creating rotation in that region compared to a wide infrasternal angle, or at least they can do it faster because of their ability to move the viscera out of the way. Now, folks, does that mean that, well, okay, I got a wide infrasternal angle, I guess that means I can never be a high-level baseball player or a golfer, I might as well just stick to powerlifting? False. Here's the interesting thing, folks. So at Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare, where I work, we get a lot of high-level golfers. And most of the high-level golfers that I've worked with, ones that are on the tour or they're very good amateurs, they're wide ISAs. How in the heck is that possible? I think the reason why that's possible is because structural lower thorax structure is only one component of the ability to rotate well. You have the rest of the body that needs to be able to rotate effectively. I have to be able to rotate in the upper thorax. The pelvis has to be able to rotate also. And if you have any deficits in those areas, or if I'm an athlete who can compensate in some way, shape, or form in those areas. I might be able to pick up leverage to be able to rotate enough that I can still perform my sport quite well. A prime example of this would be if you looked at the steroid era of baseball. So Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa. I think, now obviously they had the juice involved in a lot of those cases, but if you look at their body structure, clearly those folks are not narrow infrasternal angle presentations. So they can still hit a baseball incredibly well. And in fact, someone who has a wider rib cage, even though they might not be able to rotate as fast, they're going to be able to rotate with much more power because of leverage in other specific areas. Even though the abs play a huge role in rotation, it's not the only part that we rotate through. And you could conceive of someone who's restricted anteriorly and posteriorly in the thorax, especially if they're a narrow infrasternal angle, they may stink at rotation, because when you rotate, you have to be able to expand both front side and back side, depending on what direction you're rotating in. There's blogs that I'll link that will dive into a bit more in that when you check out the show notes. The second piece, and we cannot ignore this, is that rotation is a skill, and we can't discount the skill component of your ability to rotate, whether it's swinging a baseball or swinging a golf club. And I have one guy in particular right now who I'm working with who's he's a high-level amateur golfer, wide ISA, very stiff ability to rotate in the uppermost segments of the thorax, but he's one of the most consistent hitters out there. And that's why he's so good. And the reason why is because he can put the ball where he wants to, and he knows how to move his body within the constraints that he has available. There's a skill component. And he might be able to do better than someone who perhaps has better movement capabilities but doesn't have the skill fine-tuned to the extent that he does. Skill plays a big role in your ability to perform anything. And if you know how to move your body within the constraints available, you could potentially do significantly better than someone who moves better than you. Interesting thing with this guy, we've been working on some stuff to increase his range of motion where he's restricted, and he's adding several yards to his hits. He's hitting straighter now because of this, because he would hit it off even though it would go where he wanted it to go. And his club speed has changed just by increasing his movement repertoire. Motion that's available is only one component, and skill many times can trump your movement capabilities. So we have to look at all of these factors because they all play a role in one's ability to rotate effectively or not. To summarize your amazing question, Terry, narrow ISAs definitely have a greater ability to rotate because of their ability to mobilize the guts and the leverage of the external obliques. But lower thorax rotation is only one piece of the equation. You got to look at the uppers, you got to look at the pelvis, and you have to look at the skill that is involved with rotation. Unbelievable question, Terry. Oh, Nick Krishna asks, ilium and sacral movement during these rotational movements. To me, I think it's easier to, this is a good question. How does the ilium and the sacrum move as I'm rotating? Let's assume we're going left to right in a golf swing, for example. So realize, folks, there's not much movement at the SI joint. So you're not going to have these crazy excursions that my son will show. He's a little hypermobile, gets it from his mom. But if I'm rotating left to right, you're basically going to see the sacrum move far left to far right. Okay? As this happens, when I tip back to the left, you're going to have some sacral counter nutation involved, which is going to create an anterior rotation of the ilium. So that has to create some space. From here, then, as I go to the right, you're going to have compressive actions on the back of the pelvis that are going to push me that direction. So as I reach, how about that? I'm reaching forward. You're going to get some nutation of the sacrum. That's going to aid in the rightward rotation and a subsequent posterior rotation of the left innominate. That's going to help push me to the right. Once I've done that and I've realized full right rotation, you get a re-counter nutation of the sacrum on both sides, that allow me to complete the rotation available. So you get a subsequent counter nutation. I begin nutating, and then I re-counter nutate as I go from left to right. It's the same mechanics that we see in the squat. Folks, it's the same thing that we see as we go overhead. It's the concept of alternating external, internal, and external rotation, which you definitely got to give some credit to Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman for breaking it down so simply. But that's basically the way most of us move, is we have these alternations in rotation that happen with just about any movement. And it's all the same thing. It's just we're biasing it in different directions. So counter nutation, I begin to nutate, but I could still be counter nutated potentially. And then I have a re-counter nutation that pushes me all the way to the full rotation. Awesome question. Nick Krishna. Ruben Rothel 3000. I haven't heard from you in a hot minute, man. How are you? Are single arm and single leg exercises good forms of shifting without really using resets to accomplish this? If put in the right positions for said exercise. Ruben Rothel 3000, you are spot on. Rotation is a cheat code. This was something that I talked about in Human Matrix that we had last week, which was dope and super safe. We had everyone test. We were wearing masks. We were doing all types of stuff to keep it safe. Stay tuned if you want to learn more about how you can attend. But single arm activities and single leg activities that drive rotation are a cheat code to increase movement options. And the reason why that is because when you rotate, you're going to get anterior expansion on one side and posterior expansion on the opposite side. Most individuals, I can only speak upon my population, but most of the individuals who I work with have restrictions front side and back side. Rotation allows you to get both. The key, though, in order to make sure you're rotating well is rotating with integrity, and that's by making sure you have the stack first. If you can't stack, you're not going to be able to rotate well, and you won't be able to talk to me. Because if you can't stack, don't talk to Zach. So one thing that you will see when you're driving rotation in the thorax is if I don't have lower ribcage position, one may either crunch down and try to rotate, or they may shove the ribcage forward as they're trying to rotate. Getting lower ribcage position can help mitigate that. In the pelvis, a lot of times when you're doing some type of shifting-based activity, you'll see the pelvis dump anteriorly, which will mitigate the amount of rotation that they'll be able to do. So you have to make sure that you can attain the stack first before going into that. Now, if you want to learn how to stack, you want to learn how to tuck effectively, how to get a full exhale, and then, folks, progress it to more challenging exercises like single arm and single leg stuff without issues. My seminar, Human Matrix, is the place to do it. And I do have a new location involved, folks. The next one that's available is April 10th and 11th in Warren, Ohio, May 29th and 30th, Boston, Massachusetts, August 14th and 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan, September 25th and 26th, Wyckoff, New Jersey. And folks, this is the new one, October 23rd and 24th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm excited about that one. And then lastly, November 6th and 7th, Charlotte, North Carolina. I may have a couple others in the books. Stay tuned. Dan, y'all asking a lot of questions. This is good. What are some skills other than rotation you think narrows would be better at, and vice versa? Wides better than narrows. So I actually talked about this in a yoga teacher training that I was a part of through Steph Gongora. I'll link it in the show notes. They do some really good stuff if you're interested in yoga. I've taken a few of her classes, and she, aside from wrecking me, she's got some incredible cues, and she seems to do it right. So check them out. Because of the eccentric orientation of the pelvic floor, among other things, generally, not everyone, of course, but generally narrow ISAs are going to have a bit more inherent flexibility than a wide. And to give you an example, look at those folks who are specializing in activities that require extreme flexibility. Gymnastics, yoga, cheerleading, dance. Most of them are not big people, at least the really good ones. They are more narrow ribcage orientations, so that helps them bias them to be more successful. So if you need more flexibility in a given craft, there's likely going to be a greater predisposition to narrows gravitating that way. Another thing that narrows might be better at than wides is endurance-based sports. Because if I have a narrow rib cage, I have less space available to account for. It's a more efficient posture. If you read the torso integration hypothesis revisited by Torres Tamayo, it'll be linked in the show notes. They talk about how a narrow rib cage allows for better heat dissipation compared to someone who's wider. Think Kenyan distance runner versus Eskimo. Because of that heat dissipation, they can, in theory, be significantly better at endurance-based activities. So the one exception would be if someone has a really tall pelvis. I saw this in the Navajo population that I worked with when I was in Page, Arizona. A lot of them had wider rib cages, but also as a part of their culture, endurance running is a big component of it. And I think the reason why that is because they generally had taller pelvises in comparison to other people who are wider ISA, IPA presentations. So that's another domain that a narrow would be better in comparison to a wide. Flexibility, endurance-based sports. Wides, more force production, more power. That has to do with the concentric bias based on their axial structure. So most really good power lifters, probably going to be wide ISAs. Most power athletes, think of the V shape. Wide ISA, most likely the case. Elite level bodybuilders, because they have the V taper as well, they just have a bigger frame to tolerate more muscle mass. Wide ISAs. And those are really the extremes that I would think would be better at based on structure alone. Now again, I will preface this, that doesn't mean that you're only going to see really good bodybuilders who are wide ISAs and you're only going to see really good flexibility athletes who are narrow ISAs. Not always the case, because as we mentioned before, structure is only one piece of the puzzle. This is Nick Krishna. Thank you, Zach. Will there be any relative motion between the femurs and whole pelvis, or do we lock the hip joint as a whole and only work relatively within the pelvis? No, you're definitely going to have some femoral motions along with that, just because the muscles that move the pelvis also move the femurs. If we use the left rotation example, even though I'm ERing, I, in theory, should have a relative internal rotation in the backswing, and then I'm going to have external rotation happen in mid and late in that sense. So, yeah, you will have femur movements as well. Whew. Empowered Performance PT. The questions, y'all are killing it. Juiced up as all hell because of it. When an innominate rotates externally on a fixed femur, the femur is internally oriented relative to the innominate. Is this considered hip, ER, or IR? It would be pelvic ER, and then if the femur is in this position, it's going to be femoral IR. At least that's how I would think of it. Or the femur would be internally rotating. It just depends, in terms of what the total motion is going to be, it depends on what I'm getting more relative motion of, the SI joint or the pelvis versus the femur. The last question, which is also Terry, because Terry's a legend. Here's what Terry asks. You talked about using shoulder external rotation at 90 degrees as a proxy for determining a need for expansion in the posterior lower thorax. The majority of my guys are hypermobile in that measurement. However, I still believe there still could be potential restrictions in the lower posterior thorax. Is there another way to assess this? Additionally, is an increase in external rotation for a baseball player still indicative of a posteriorly oriented thorax? Again, thank you for your time and the work you have done. Thank you, Terry. When I'm checking external rotation at 90 degrees, that's going to correspond with the ability to expand the posterior thorax at T6 to T8-ish. There's a post I'll link in the show notes that dives into a bit more of the mechanics, but it has to do with the relative anatomy of the subscapularis and the oblique fibers and its subsequent location. Check it out in the show notes, zachcouples.com/rotational-athletes if you want to learn more. So 90 degrees ER, if you got that, chances are you're going to have expansion there. But baseball players and rotational athletes, by golly bows, they screw things up a little bit. Because you can cheat having full ER, or in the case that Terry's talking about, too much external rotation. If I orient the thorax posteriorly, so I tip it backwards, that's like doing an extreme posterior tilt of the pelvis. When I posteriorly tilt the pelvis, the acetabulum is going to retrovert, aka point backwards, which helps give or orients the femurs into external rotation. When I posteriorly orient or tilt the thorax, the scapula is going to orient into external rotation. The glenoid, where the humerus resides, is going to be retroverted, and that will cause a retroversion or retrotorsion of the humerus as well, giving an increase in humeral external rotation. And this actually corresponds with some of the research when we look at how the bony changes are impacted with throwers in particular. There's a great study I'll link in the show notes. And there's also a really good blog post that I didn't realize it was controversial until I did some research for this in terms of why internal rotation is lost. But, saying like there's a capsular restriction might be called into question. Terry's asking, well, Zach, is this just a structural thing at the humerus? Well, here's the issue, Terry. If I retrovert the glenoid, that's going to create a concomitant retrotorsion of the humerus. So I think that this is totally in line with a posterior tilt of the thorax. You may have some degree of posterior tilting that corresponds to or potentially even drives the retrotorsion that we see at the humerus that creates external rotation. How would you know? How would you know that maybe we're just dealing with a humeral issue and the scapulothoracic joint is on point? You got to look at some other ways to check posterior thorax expansion. The way you can check those pesky rotational athletes is with an externally rotated biased shoulder flexion. Because here's the issue. When I go overhead, the humerus has to externally rotate, 1, and the scapula has to be able to upwardly rotate, 2. Well, if I got a boatload of ER, I should be able to go overhead easy peasy because I have more than enough external rotation to complete arm elevation. But here's the issue. If I have a posteriorly oriented thorax, muscles between the shoulder blades are going to be more concentrically biased because those muscles aid in the posterior tilting of the thorax. So you might have enough humeral motion to go overhead, but if your scapula is glued to your upper back, you are going to be restricted in shoulder flexion. When you're testing this, you want to make sure you start low to the body, because in someone who's vastly restricted, even though they got excessive ER, you might see them deviate out of the sagittal plane quite early in the arc of flexion. So you want to start really low. And if you see a loss of shoulder flexion, even though there's a ton of humeral ER, you cannot trust the external rotation measure. Boom, you got a posterior thorax restriction, secondary to a posterior tilt. Now, we know how those pesky baseball players and rotational athletes are. They are rock star compensators because that's how they do what they do. Sometimes that could lead to a increase in shoulder flexion secondary to eccentric orientation of the anterior inferior structures of the shoulder capsule, among other things. A lot of times when you do that in the shoulder flexion, you'll see an inferior glide of the humerus as you test them. So that could be one thing. But if you get someone who you test ER and it's a lot, you test shoulder flexion and it's like, wow, that's really good, but you still got some issues. I'm not sure I can trust that measure. Your last safety valve for ensuring that they do have posterior expansion is to check lower cervical rotation. There's a good debrief where I dive into that. Check it out in the show notes. But if you check lower cervical rotation, many times they will be limited in rotating ipsilaterally. Let's say we're using left shoulder flexion as an example. So they got, say, 120 degrees of ER. They got 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. If they can't rotate the head to the left, that would indicate that they do not have posterior expansion on the upper left part of the thorax, T2 to T4 area. Actually, it would be down to T5, or T5 to potentially T6, depending on the anatomy, just because of some of the neck muscles that are involved with rotation. Those are really your checks to see if you're dealing with a true posterior orientation of the thorax, or if you do have something locally going on at the humerus. Now, of course, what you going to do about it? That's probably the more important question. If you have those restrictions, you need to fill the posterior thorax from the bottom up. Great moves to start would be cross-connect variations, because you're going to do a low reach while driving rotation in the upper thorax. That can kill two birds with one stone. The more birds we kill, the better. The reason why is because I don't like them. I was injured by a bird one time when I was just out of PT school, so we got beef, you know what I mean? It's all right, though. Anyways, I'll tell the story another day. You could then progress to armbar variations where you're driving rotation of the arm and the neck at the same time, and if you do those things, you're going to get good posterior expansion. Life will be good, and no one will mess with you, and no one will definitely mess with your rotational athletes. Terry, unbelievable question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in, and I appreciate your support. If you want to learn more, here's the place to go. The place to go, folks, is zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter, because you'll get access to so much free stuff, it's disgusting. One, you'll get access to Human Matrix Foundations, my free course that gives you a lot of the fundamentals needed to learn all of the concepts in the movement debrief, among other things that we have. If you're like, I don't know about infrasternal angles all that much, this is the place to check it. You'll also get the Common Compensations workbook, absolutely free, which will not only give you the didactic stuff, but it will give you access to how I can see these compensations when I'm coaching with someone. So check that out there. You'll also get a bunch of free talks, and life will be good. There's a lot of services available. If you're someone who like, man, my rotation is whack, should I talk to Zach? Matter of fact, you should. Online consults, movement-wise, where it's at. What I'll do with that is I will check your ability to move. We'll find out where your restrictions are. I'll coach you through some activities to improve those restrictions so you can rotate and be more boss than Rick Ross. If you want to kick it up a notch, Emeril Lagasse style, which of course you do. If you also want to improve your fitness levels on top of that, then training with me remotely is the place to be with your boy Big Z. Man, that coffee was good this morning. Because what we can do with that, if you train with me, is I can take the movement consultation information that we went through, devise a fitness program that respects your movement capabilities, expands your movement repertoire, and your fitness at the same time. It's awesome. You definitely want to check it out. Folks, I only got about 2 slots available right now, so if you want to train with me, you better hop on it. Maybe you want to learn how to rotate better with your specific athletes. Terry, maybe you're like, man, I got all these narrow ISA baseball players, and I really want to design a better program to enhance their rotational capabilities. Well, folks, mentoring is a way to do that, because what we can do is I can look at your situation, help you problem solve through any didactic issues that you may have, and most importantly, I'll watch your coaching capabilities. We'll go through particular cases so you can apply the material that you learn. Information's free, but application is the thing that separates the people who can learn a lot and the people who can help people get better. Mentoring can help you with the application process, so definitely check that out. Once you've scoured zachcouples.com, you've read all the blogs, you've checked everything out that there is. Maybe you read my About Me section. Who knows? The next place to find me is on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher by searching The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 145 other debriefs out there, and there's a lot of podcasts out there. And, you know, we didn't have 2 cameras, definitely didn't have the fancy schmancy light during all of them, so maybe you just want to listen to the earlier ones. I get it. Definitely check me out there, and while you're there, leave a review so the fam can keep growing. I'm also on the social medias. Check me out first on YouTube by searching Zach Couples. If you want to see what type of activities I'm using with my Supreme clientele and you need some different variations, maybe you're like, man, I want to improve shoulder flexion, but I don't know what moves I can use to do that. We talk about that on the YouTube channel, so you want to check that out. You also want to look me up on Facebook and Twitter, /Z Couples and @Z Couples. And of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby! Zach, ZAC, Couples, CUPPLES. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. And I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.